So good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's speaker session. Glad to have all of you here. Today's event is, of course, hosted by the Indian Foreign Policy Project, which is IFPP, in collaboration with ORCA, which is the Organization for Research on China and Asia. I am Ajitesh Vishwanath, the founder and the interim chair of IFPP, and part of our mandate is to deepen civic engagement in South Asian affairs as well as IR. And this series is part of our effort to connect with young researchers, young leaders, diplomats, uh, to our student community from across India. So a couple of guidelines before we start. This is going to be an interactive session, so we will be having a Q&A at the end. So we obviously value diversity in perspectives, so please be respectful and be open to viewpoints throughout this discussion. We are also going to be recording this event, which will be shared on our platforms along with the transcript. You are obviously welcome to add in your thoughts and questions in the chat box whenever you feel, and use the raise hand feature during the audience discussion round, and stay muted unless recognized. Thank you for your cooperation. So today's event is titled Expression, Identity, and Politics, Understanding the Queerness and Nonconformity in the PRC. It is based on an article series written by the speaker for ORCA. Our speaker today is, of course, Miss Ahana Roy. Um, Ms. Roy is a researcher specializing in gender and politics in China. She holds a master's degree in political science with a specialization in IR from the Department of IR at Jadavpur University, Kolkata. She has taken on a variety of positions before. Previously, she served as the research associate and the chief operations officer at ORCA in New Delhi. Her research areas also include non-traditional security studies, particularly focusing on gender and sexuality, as well as society and culture in China and East Asia. Thank you so much, Ms. Roy, for joining us, and thank you for participating in this discussion.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening, Ajitesh. Thank you for that introduction. I'm very happy to be here, and I want to extend my gratitude to IFPP and ORCA for this incredible opportunity to, present my research on the LGBTQ plus community in China.
Thank you for being here again. We'll start off with a brief note on the topic. So, identity and rights, of course, have always been regarded as the core of IR and the core of human rights declaration as a whole. However, a significant chunk of communities around the globe continue to be repressed, continue to be regarded as something different, apart from society. And whenever they do not conform to obviously pre established gender and sexual identities, especially in the Asian context. So, today we will discuss the history of queerness in China and Xi Jinping's, and by extension, the PRC's policies, international pressures, and its corresponding reforms, and the extent of conformity in the modern Chinese state. We'll also be briefly discuss the importance of the inclusion of the LGBTQ plus community in the Chinese political economy and the incentives therein. So, Ms. Roy, let's start right, like very light. What drew you to write this series and research on LGBTQ plus rights in China?
So when I was working at ORCA, I had during I think the 20th Party Congress, we started writing about how elite politics sort of works in the Chinese context, and I wanted to focus on women especially, and how women are represented in Chinese politics, and I think from having done research on women and feminism in China, it sort of was a very natural transition towards understanding how the LGBTQ plus community also fared in the Chinese context, and it was especially interesting to me because it is such a different society. And to be considered something that is not the norm in a society like China was very interesting for me to, sort of get into. Yeah.
All right, that was quite an interesting take to a good, huge article series, which I have obviously, all of us at IFPP have already read about it and quite interesting to find. So we'll start with the first segment, which is context and the history. I'll just stop sharing perhaps. And can you tell us a little bit more about the historical context of queerness in China? What has been the major events? Whether this is a new occurrence or is this community rooted in Chinese culture?
Sure. What I can do is I can also share my screen because I have a presentation ready for it. Just let me know if you're able to view it. Okay. 1 second. Uh, can you view
Yeah,
it?
it's perfectly visible.
All right, perfect, great. So let me just give you some context about the queer community in China. So, it is the largest LGBTQ plus community globally. But, despite this significant demographic, the journey towards, equality, recognition, and sort of acceptance has been fraught with challenges, largely sort of influenced by deep rooted cultural, social and political factors. So to understand the current state of LGBTQ plus rights in China, it is essential to address a common misconception that homosexuality is inherently against traditional Chinese culture. Historically, Chinese culture has displayed a certain level of tolerance towards same-sex relationships. It wasn't sort of celebrated; it was still taboo, but there was some sort of tolerance towards it, and it wasn't demonized as such. And this was recorded in ancient texts and historical accounts. So it wasn't until 1740, during the Qing dynasty, that homosexuality was decreed illegal for the first time in Chinese history. So this was also the period when Confucianism, with its emphasis on filial piety, societal harmony, and the centrality of the family unit, became sort of sanctified and began to play a pivotal role in shaping societal attitudes towards LGBTQ plus individuals. So, the societal pressure to marry, produce heirs, uphold family honor, compounded by, sort of state policies, can often clash with principles of inclusivity, sort of, which are desired by queer individuals, which can lead to, internal conflicts and societal tensions. So, even after the establishment of the PRC, the People's Republic of China, as we know today, queer people were targeted and charged with hooliganism during the Cultural Revolution. So, the I think it was the 1980s was when queer issues began to be more uh, openly talked about, or talked about at all. And it was the beginning of sort of gradual liberalization in China, both economically and socially as well. It was the reform and opening up era. So even though this was happening in the 1980s, it wasn't until I think 1997 that homosexuality was decriminalized, which was a significant yet a very quiet milestone in the history of LGBTQ plus rights in China. So the 1990s was, when one witnessed the emergence of grassroots LGBTQ plus organizations, which played a very crucial role in advocating for the rights and recognition of the community. And a huge catalyst in this was the fourth UN World Conference on Women, held in Beijing in 1995, which led to the proliferation of feminist and queer organizations simultaneously, almost. So these organizations operate in a very challenging environment, which I'll get to later in more depth. But while they have grown in visibility and influence over the years, they are still facing challenges due to the state scrutiny that is there in China, legal constraints, and societal prejudice. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. Interestingly, since you said that it's not against tradition to be queer or being part of the LGBT community, that's not what the CCP kind of projects in the media as well. Do you think the CCP's assertion that this is a Western phenomena is correct?
So, I mean, the thing with the CPC and and Xi Jinping himself, by extension his policies, is the fact that Confucian values that sort of emphasize social control are entrenched in the policies of the CPC and Xi Jinping. So, even if they want to portray it as a Western import, it isn't necessarily, one can argue that it is not necessarily a Western import that was happening. More so, it could be argued that it was a Western import to criminalize homosexuality, you know. So there is definitely an influence of how they want to sort of put put traditional Chinese culture and traditional Chinese norms on one end, and homosexuality or different sort of sexual orientations and gender identities on the other hand. But it doesn't necessarily have to be so.
Thank you. And since these laws which criminalized homosexuality and current policies in general will also have an effect on general citizenship views on how people in China view this community as well. Since this community is rooted in traditional Chinese culture, do you think there has been a larger shift towards alienating this community at large, or is this a kind of a graph of wavy kind of interaction?
So I would say that definitely it is much more challenging to be a part of the queer community in a closed society, because not many people are as educated about things that they are not necessarily familiar with. So it can be a very unfamiliar and a very difficult part for them to understand and accept that these kind of differing sexual orientations, differing gender identities can exist. So while there has been a much greater acceptance now because of the work of the queer organizations, they have worked to increase visibility and influence about queer issues on the mainstream. It's still not it's still not the most how do I explain it, it's still not very uh, accepted, I would say. To sort of make homosexuality and the family, which I could argue is one of the biggest impediments to queer discourse in China, because most of family honor or sort of societal norm comes from the fact that you want to have a lineage and you want to have children, and to go against that feels like sort of dishonor. So while there has been discrimination, ostracization, harassment, based on sexual and gender identities, I wouldn't go as far as to say that all of it is like a black box. There is a gray area where people, especially in the urban centers, are much more open and are much more likely to not really care to base their opinions on somebody's sexual identity or gender identity. So it's a long way to go, but the fact that they are the fact that gay people exist in China itself is activism, in my view. Yeah.
So, of course, you talked about major international conferences and the international community as a whole affecting this kind of movement in China, especially with liberalization of the Chinese economy and opening up of, well, people and communities across the globe as well. Do you feel, how important do you feel the international community has played a role in this event movement in large in China?
So one second, let me just share my screen with you. Yeah. So one second. Yeah. So as I mentioned, the 1990s was when grassroots LGBTQ organizations really took off, and here the in the 1990s was when the international gay movement had a very notable, but I would say a limited impact on LGBTQ plus rights in China. So like I mentioned before, the World Conference on Women was, brought international attention, was very pivotal in sort of getting all that attention to gender and sexual rights, encouraging local activists to adopt global strategies for advocacy. Not only that, they also played a role in raising awareness, establishing transnational networks, as well as providing financial backing. But also, the outbreak of the HIV/AIDS crisis in China, led to the LGBTQ plus community receiving further attention. But this uh, initial movement of queer identity and consolidation of the movement in China was dominated by gay men who are known as the Tongji, and it overshadowed the experiences of queer women or Lala women and other marginalized communities. So, as a result, what happened was the Lala movement began to operate in the periphery, with considerably less visibility and influence. So, even the financial backing that the queer community did receive from the international movement was mainly focused on much more Western aspects and much more male dominated. So so it was very important for also the advocacy reforms or efforts that was pushed by the West were very Western in nature. So it is important to sort of understand this Tongchi Lala dichotomy within the LGBTQ plus movement in China, because it reflects a sort of divide between the experiences and priorities of gay men who were mostly urban affluent Han Chinese, and on the one hand, and queer women, bisexuals, transgenders, gender non-conforming individuals on the other. So it is important to note this because it has a huge influence on the trajectory of LGBTQ plus activism that we see today in China, because it has led to some tensions and challenges in creating a much more unified queer movement in China. So when we also talk about sort of Western notions like, say, pride, their pride has taken place, although rarely. It has taken place in China from backing of like Western consulates in China and from international organizations. But uh, pride and queer discourse itself is largely Western centric. So there are cultural and institutional barriers in China which impede the localization of global queer discourse, and as such so what happens is that these Western centric approaches to advocacy may clash with what the locals would prioritize instead. So there's also been debate surrounding whether the term LGBTQ plus and global queer praxis could even be applied appropriately to the queer movement in China. So there is a growing need for a much more inclusive approach both in China and globally, to amplify diverse intersections of gender, sexuality, ethnicity, class, within the LGBTQ plus spectrum in China itself. But while, the Western style pride events are rare in the mainland, like I mentioned, there is there is a growing sense of pride within the local community. Okay, pride that is very specific to the Chinese context, which is reflected in the increasing visibility of queer culture, especially in urban areas. So I would say that the international queer movement has definitely helped the queer movement in China proliferate. It its influence can't be overstated. Yeah.
So, of course, with these kind of restrictions already in Chinese media in place, there is difficulty of any kind of group to advocate for any kind of issue. For example, when we live in a democracy, it's much easier to raise up to issues or advocate for certain issues. How have the queer community in China sort of started off their movement, starting from 1990 to today, and using that kind of digital space for the same as well?
So, when you look at say these organizations, and especially queer organizations, and how they operate, they don't have much legal protection or government backing. So, given that the state is sort of overly conscious of not promoting anything that is openly LGBTQ plus, so there are almost no NGOs dedicated to LGBTQ plus advocacy that are formally registered with local civil affairs bureaus in China. So, as such, what LGBTQ groups have to do is that they have to operate in a gray area, and they have to navigate sort of a fine line between state tolerance and repression. So it's a very precarious and liminal position because it requires activists to be strategic and creative and often focus on low key grassroots efforts rather than large scale public demonstrations. So, by employing these sort of creative means, they have made use of digital spaces and media, like you mentioned, and which have become essential tools for LGBTQ plus advocacy in contemporary China. So these platforms allow activists to sort of circumvent traditional media censorship and connect with a broader audience, raising awareness, fostering a sense of community. However, while sort of engaging in online discourse, queer individuals also have to be very cautious of not threatening the party state's authority, because I would also argue that along with censorship and social change, economic interests are also they also have a huge role to play in influencing queer expression and activism online. So there's so the state not only sort of censors traditional media but digital media as well. So the it basically exercises tight control over collective expression um, in both traditional and digital media, which is predominantly state owned as well. So, content related to, say, LGBTQ plus issues is often suppressed. For example, in 2021, the government began to crack down on the presence of cis men and effeminate women in television. So even censorship in order to maintain a cooperative and reciprocal relationship with political authorities. So in 2023, Chinese censors will suddenly shut down some public WeChat accounts, which specifically those that focused on feminist and LGBTQ plus issues, which also highlights how, despite the potential, the empowering potential of social media, its effectiveness is contingent on the shifts in government policy, the shifts in platform regulations, technological accessibility. So there are these sort of things that the queer community has to be aware of and very cautious of when they are um, sort of engaging in queer discourse online.
Thank you. These were a lot of interesting points that we want to discuss. Let's start off with understanding the kind of rights that queer people do have in China at the
Mhm.
moment. What are the rights guaranteed by the state, and what are the like loopholes that they have been using, or the kind of gray areas that are still being needs to be addressed by policymakers?
Right. So, China's current penal code does not contain any explicit prohibition of homosexuality. And in 2001, homosexuality was also removed from the official list of disorders. But in the same way, same-sex marriage is remains unrecognized in China. So there is a lack of sort of legal recognition for same-sex couples, which denies them essential rights, benefits such as inheritance rights, healthcare decision making, social security benefits, which uh, a normal heterosexual couple would receive. So it is also important to sort of note that most of the existing anti discrimination laws in China tend to focus only on male homosexuality and have historically had a very narrow focus on gender. So, women's sexuality are barely talked about, possibly even repressed, because a significant portion, not just women, but also transgender people, questioning people, non-conforming people, none of their issues are really discussed, which further exacerbates the discrimination and social stigma and the harassment that they face, because if nobody really talks about it, nobody really knows what is actually happening. So there's this vulnerability of the LGBTQ plus community, which is also heightened due to a lack of legal protection, benefits, comprehensive social services, and they often don't have access to healthcare, housing, other essential services. So it is and this is also compounded by societal marginalization that they face. It's not just a biological thing. It's more about how they are seen as perverse because of most of the time they're either migrants or rural or poor, and don't have the resources that they need to educate themselves or others around them. So but there are, however, some limited rights provided for queer people in China. Same sex couples have been granted some limited medical care and property management rights under the legal guardianship system, and queer people have the right to gender reassignment surgery, the ability to change one's gender on official documents. However, these rights are often sort of accompanied by very strict regulations and a lot of like bureaucratic hurdles that might make it difficult to access these sort of rights. So it is a very sort of difficult and ambiguous situation where everybody knows that they exist and homosexuality exists, but nobody really wants to talk about it and just rather evade that entire community and not get into a direct confrontation with it. So when you also look at, say, the workplace, there are significant policy gaps that impacts the retention of domestic talent and domestic labor supply in China. So while China has an employment promotion law which bans discrimination based on gender, race, religion, ethnicity, it does not explicitly prohibit discrimination against sexual minorities. So the absence of these explicit anti-discrimination protections and equal opportunities in a majority of professional settings means that queer employees often face very hostile work environments, leading to lower job satisfaction, lower productivity levels, and much higher turnover rates. And as a result, what happens is there has been a trend of migration. So a lot of queer individuals will migrate to countries which are much more welcoming of their sexual identity and their gender identity. And this can also be seen as a negative thing for China, because it essentially means there is a brain drain in China, in the mainland. And it's also about the geopolitics of how the global talent distribution is sort of in one sector, because queer people don't feel that they are accepted enough or can't lead the life that they want. So there are a lot of implications and consequences that happen due to queer people not having the rights
Should I cook
or
something for
that
him?
they deserve.
What? I don't know.
Have there perhaps been major
What?
instances in China's judiciary? Like is
Could
there even a
be
system of judiciary in place that
huh?
tackles these kind of issues? Any major cases perhaps from there as well?
So there have been judicial cases, people taking their cases to the courts, trying to get the courts to give them the benefits that they seek. So, for instance, there was a case when a man had to go through gender reassignment surgery, and they were fired from their job because of the leave that they had to take. So once they moved the court for it, they were granted, compensation for being fired. But that is a very rare case, and it's also based on like the province that you're in. So it's not a encompassing view of China. There was a very famous case where this lady Chu Bai, sort of sued the she sued the Ministry of Education because they were carrying homophobic textbooks in universities, and she sued the ministry a couple of times, and she kept getting rejected every single time. But what happens on the flip side is that uh, more than them seeking, say, legal reforms and advocating for legal rights, it has also led to much more visibility and discussion about how these rights are absent for queer individuals. A lot of heteronormative sort of individuals don't even realize that there are rights that they have taken for granted that is not available to a person just based on their sexual identity or their gender identity. So there have been lots of uh, there have been a lot of uh, same sex marriages that have taken place in China. They aren't marriages in the legal sense, more so in a very symbolic sense, but there has been advocacy for legal reforms for same sex partnerships to be recognized, for transgender rights. There has always been a advocacy effort made for these legal reforms, which also is a byproduct of the Western influence that they have of sort of changing the institutionalization and legalization of these rights. So there have been efforts to move the courts and to get legal access to these rights, but it hasn't been the most it's not easy. It's not easy. It's going to take much longer, and they can't afford to question the state's authority as such, or come into direct confrontation with the state's authority, because queer individuals do not want to seem like a threat to the state or the state's national interest or security or even its legitimacy. What it wants for the state to do is recognize that they are not against the state, but uh, and they're not an individualistic sort of a group, but more of a collective which does belong in the PRC.
Right. We also kind of see a greater assertion of conservatism across China in Xi's rule in the last decade. Can you tell us a little bit more about his specific policies and his role in the CPC, which has
um,
changed this?
sure. Uh, sure. So, as I mentioned before, Confucian values, they are the most, like, they are enmeshed and embedded in the CPC and Xi Jinping's policies. So, for instance, if you look at Xi's Common Prosperity Initiative, there has been a renewed focus on social stability and harmony, often at the expense of individual rights and freedoms. So the LGBTQ plus community, like you mentioned, perceived as and bracketed as a Western import, challenging these traditional Chinese norms, has faced increasing scrutiny and suppression under this initiative. And the CPC also has adopted a three no's policy towards LGBTQ plus issues, which essentially is that there's no approval, there's no disapproval, and no promotion. So this policy mainly sees itself manifest particularly within the areas of healthcare, education, media, further, and which further complicates advocacy efforts, because healthcare, education, and media are sort of the institutions where it is possible to change the narratives, where it is possible to change the institutionalization of it. So this ambiguity and this ambiguous stance allows the state to maintain control over queer expression while avoiding direct confrontation with the community. But this ambiguity also shows that the party's policy focus on maintaining social harmony and social stability often translates to a very low prioritization of issues related to sexual orientation and gender identity, which are sidelined or ignored, leaving the community without the legal protections and recognitions they deserve. So it has resulted in the CPC taking very contradictory stances on LGBTQ plus issues. So on the one hand, China accepted five of the UN Human Rights Council's recommendations on LGBTQ plus rights in 2019, and on the other hand, it has made efforts to systematically restrict the LGBTQ plus community. Like censorship and control over civic discourse are key tools used by the party state to manage any threat that it might deem inimical to its legitimacy. As a result, the CPC has resorted to banning and censoring content like queer related content online, forcefully closing queer organizations. For instance, like Shanghai Pride had to be closed down. Like it wasn't a very explicit sort of demand from the state, but it was implicit in the fact that it was getting difficult for Shanghai Pride to operate, which is because of, say, government coercion. So it makes it more difficult for activists, queer activists, feminist activists to organize and mobilize support and solidarity openly without risking state intervention or apprehension. But on the other hand, you can also see that compared to Beijing's handling of human rights issues in Xinjiang or Hong Kong, China's relative tolerance for LGBTQ plus issues can be seen. But this tolerance is contingent on, like I mentioned before, the community's ability to sort of remain confrontational and avoid the party's authority. Yeah.
Right. So, what are the base incentives for for the president and the policymakers in large to include them, make some inclusive laws, especially referring to the political or economic incentives for the same as well?
So, I mean, the it's like a two-way street. The queer community has to sort of make Beijing understand that their goals and their priorities for equality and inclusion don't go against the goals or the CPC's goals of social harmony and effective governance, and it contributes more towards Xi Jinping's dream of national rejuvenation, and the achievement of China's second centennial goal of becoming a modern socialist country by 2049. So there are also economic advantages of LGBTQ plus inclusion and uh, you know um, in the economy, because of the more labor and the more people you have, the better it is for like macroeconomic development as well. The better it is for businesses to have employees who are productive the better it is for not just businesses and like employers, but also for even heterosexual or like non heterosexual or people who are not necessarily homosexual will also be more interested, I guess, or more inclined to work for a company that or a business that sort of promotes inclusivity and diversity. But also it depends on where, if the country feels that diversity is important enough, or if the country feels that inclusivity is a priority for them. So while there are definitely benefits to uh, getting the LGBTQ community and utilizing their full potential, because it is a huge consumer market as well. They so there has been sort of uh, you know there has been a sort of understanding of Chinese businesses who have understood the potential of the economic advantages of inclusivity and addressing the needs of queer individuals. So Chinese companies like Baidu, Meizu, they've all launched advertising campaigns, acknowledging sort of same-sex couples, and they have experienced very positive sort of business outcomes by adopting LGBTQ plus inclusive policies. So it has definitely begun. It has definitely started, but there is still a long way to go. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much. Moving towards the last section of this presentation, we'll be discussing about conformity, right? How has the LGBTQ community in general, took on this issue of conformity within this kind of lack of legal status and gray areas?
So, I mean, there have been, so when we talk about conformity, I have to always like go back to the socio-cultural sort of influences of conformity that you find not just in society but in the state as well. So there are like political and legal conformity is definitely a significant barrier to LGBTQ plus rights in China, and the state's emphasis on, conformity to traditional values and social norms makes it very difficult for queer individuals to assert their rights without facing, legal or social repercussions. But even more importantly, the since there are no comprehensive and explicit anti discrimination laws that sort of protect individuals based on sexual orientation or gender identity, they don't have much recourse, in the face of sort of injustice. So, but all of this does boil down to the fact that, social and cultural conformity is driven by Confucian values, which also drives a lot of the political and legal conformity that you find in contemporary China. So, like I mentioned before, it has an emphasis on filial piety, on social harmony, and the centrality of the family unit. So, also like filial piety, the duty towards the nation, honoring the nation and seeing the nation progress, and the emphasis on social sort of stability and harmony can manifest in a preference for conformity, and which essentially conflicts with the expression of LGBTQ plus identities. So these have implications, like these dynamics have implications which are very profound. So what happens is that queer individuals in China face a lot of structural stigmas. They face a lot of public stigmas. They face a lot of self stigmas as well. They face prejudices and discrimination. And the pressure to conform can also lead to internalized homophobia, which makes self acceptance and self identity very hard to achieve. And coming out, particularly complex. So coming out essentially is when you publicly come out with your sexual identity and your gender identity. And it is especially challenging in China, in Chinese society, due to the familial responsibilities as well as the political risks that are involved. They may be seen as the other, and could lead to social isolation, strained relationships with friends and family, and even disownment from their own families, which they who might feel ashamed or dishonored by such acts of coming out essentially. And they could face ostracism from not only their peers but also their colleagues and employers as well. So as a consequence, many LGBTQ plus people may choose to conceal their identities to avoid such discrimination. And to avoid such discrimination, a trend that can be seen in response to the complex socio-cultural and political pressures of conformity is that some LGBTQ plus individuals will enter into sham marriages or formality marriages, which are essentially heterosexual presenting relationships to fulfill familial and societal expectations while maintaining their true identity in private. So, when a straight woman marries a gay man unknowingly, the woman is known as tongchi. And when a straight man marries a lesbian woman, they are known as tongfu. And when a lesbian woman and a gay man marry each other in a formality marriage, a cooperative marriage, that marriage is known as xinghun. So there are trends of because they feel pressured into marriage, into providing an heir, into continuing the family lineage, they sometimes will have to get involved in these sham marriages, very which is a very complex and very multifaceted sort of an issue, because uh, a woman who unknowingly marries a gay man does not know about the fact that her husband is leading a secret life essentially. And it's the same for a straight man who marries uh, a, a gay woman. But there is also the notion of how women, like lesbians, could face rape allegations or abuse, because even if they do not want to be even if they do not want to be in that marriage, they still have to perform a duty towards their husbands, towards their families. So it does get a much more complicated. Also, when you look at how real estate is very important in China, and usually there's only the husband's name on the lease. So if so not only do women who get married to gay men not have any property to their name, it's always a very sort of precarious sort of um, m- situation to be in. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I wish we could ask more questions to you, but I think we should move on towards the Q&A session. So anybody from the audience who wants to ask a question, please raise your hand or type your question in the chat box and we'll take that up. Yeah, Gavish, go ahead.
Hi, a great session, first of all. I think I was just curious to hear from you in the sense of hearing about what could probably the international community at large do to make nations like China be accountable towards the LGBTQ community, because the state in these nations is ignorant, or it doesn't acknowledge the community. It does not say yes or no. It rather delays the question. So, what do you think the international community can probably come together and do to probably build a consensus around queer issues? Because queer lives suffer regardless of where they are on the globe, right? So, I think I would want to hear from you on that front. Thanks.
So, I mean, uh, I wouldn't overstate how much of an influence the international movement can have on policy or like legal reforms. It is a closed society, and they don't have a very vibrant civil society which is able to sort of champion for their rights. What the international sort of or the wider global queer movement can do is support queer individuals in China by helping them to make their own frameworks of advocacy, of how to sort of uh, bring their issues up with the state. Because while it is difficult for the queer it is difficult for the wider queer movement to also sort of get in touch with the local queer movement, because it's not always possible because of privacy issues, because of the great firewall that there is in China. It's not easy for them to be able to sort of access each other. Or even there is also a barrier, like a language barrier that exists. So what the international queer movement can do is provide support by sort of helping them build transnational networks where they can help with the use of social media as well, sort of amplify Chinese voices and amplify what Chinese queer individuals want, because it might not be the same as what the wider accepted notion of queerness is. There is a very specific queer understanding, and there's a very specific um, location of the queer discourse in China. So what the international community has to also do is you know expand its own understanding of Chinese society itself. Yeah.
I hope that answered that question, Kavish. We move towards some of the questions in the chat, perhaps, and then towards the people over here. Um, Navya has asked is, how can we build an atmosphere of inclusion regardless of our personal or religious views? And also add on to the question is like this comparative perspective as well, right? How do people in India basically reach out or see this kind of um, repression of LGBTQ rights over in China?
I mean, I wouldn't say it's easy, but I definitely wouldn't say it's not possible. I mean, there are queer individuals online, there are queer individuals in forums. There, the only difficulty is, I mean, the two neighbors don't really have the best relationship either. We're not able to have, WeChat accounts. We can't really talk to them over uh, that easily. But I would say that it isn't as hard as it might seem if we just sort of delve into it a little bit deeper. It isn't as difficult to understand that on the other side of the border people are just like us, and uh, you know they're going through challenges that we sometimes can't even fathom. Because for them it's not about making public demonstrations of activism, or it's not about how to it's more about how to lead a life that they want to lead. And when we talk about, like you mentioned, inclusion, regardless of whatever religious views you have, that I think is like always going to be a work in progress. That is something that, we have to keep learning and unlearning whatever preconceived notions or biases we might have, trying to understand where the other party comes from, trying to understand, where we come from, and, trying to, at the end of the day, uh, you know fight for the life that we all want to live. Yeah.
If you have time, we'll answer more questions, Ahana.
Sure, sure. Yeah.
All right. Rahul has asked a long question.
Mm.
The gist of it is basically what is the status of identity expression, and has this, like, these assertions of identity just been solely identity based, or focusing on redistribution and social equity, perhaps?
So that's actually a really good question, Rahul. The thing is, there is definitely it has, there are demands for redistribution, there are demands for, you know uh, I mean, you could say that essentially, to be a feminist group or a queer group, you have to ask for, institutional changes. You have to ask for structural changes. So they definitely do ask for it, but they're also very cautious of the fact that it isn't. I mean, they have to take very small incremental steps. They can't be going around, sort of trying to ask extremely difficult questions, because they probably get repressed because they're asking questions that they shouldn't be asking. So while there is obviously, they do want to have much more, as you said, redistribution and sort of structural changes, more gender mainstreaming and all the institutions that there are. But it's much more about, finding their footing. you know uh, it's much more about trying to focus on education, focus on awareness, on outreach, on building resilient networks. You know and once you have a very solid foundation, because if you're constantly getting attacked, it's very hard to even survive. So it is very difficult to ask such questions when you're not really sure about your own survival. So it is definitely an agenda. It is definitely something that they would want for. In an ideal world, it would exist, but it isn't as easy as it is to for us to theoretically sort of talk about. Yeah,
Thank you. We'll go ahead with Aryan. Why don't you ask a question?
sure.
Thank you so much, Ahana, for the presentation. My question is essentially, how does the change of legislature and inclusion in the judiciary, how big is the impact, considering India and China being very similar demographics in terms of culture? So, for example, like the familial pressure and the experiences are quite similar in the Asian sense, right?
Yeah.
In India, I think rule of law and the judiciary itself is independent from the rulers, so to say, of the country. But that's not the case in China.
No,
And
that is not the case in China. Sorry.
just a last follow up, like the legal system in China itself seems to be very the rule of law, as it were, isn't as strong as it is in India, because it's more so based on implementation in China and how it goes about that.
Right.
So I was just wondering, how impactful is such legal changes going to be?
I mean, it is definitely a win. I mean, it is definitely a win to have, the option or the choice of legal recourse. It might not seem so. Of course, there are implementation problems, but there's law implementation problems in most countries. It's not very easy to access law. I mean, even in our country, it's not very easy to, I mean, it is easy, but people will talk about like expenses, and it's just another hassle. So it is. There are bureaucratic hurdles to it. Sure, I concede with that point, but it is definitely a huge deal if there are legal recognitions to queer rights and queer issues, because that means that sets a precedent. That sets a precedent that the next generation or the person the next year might be able to sort of also like move the courts, and they will have a precedent of saying that but it happened before, so why can't it happen now? And it always seems crazy until somebody does it, and when somebody does it, it seems like a very normal thing. So and it will give queer individuals much more confidence in themselves and in their judicial system, about the protections that they can seek from it. You know.
Thank you so much, Anna.
Sure.
Due to interest in time, I'll just take two more questions from the chat.
Sure.
Uh, First, from Zubi, perhaps. In regard to queer politics in China and its complicated dynamics within Taiwan, which was the first Asian country to legalize same sex marriage, how is it affecting China's strategies, and will there be any change in stances in the next decade,
Sorry,
perhaps?
your voice cut off. Could you just repeat that question? I'm so
So
sorry.
Taiwan is perhaps the first Asian country to legalize same-sex marriage.
Right.
And
Hmm.
since it's obviously connected to China, what kind of effect will that have in Chinese kind of politics and strategies, as well as what are the future, like what will happen the next decade in Chinese affairs regarding that?
So, I mean, it's definitely going to influence Chinese society in the mainland. It's definitely going to influence how people view what they previously thought was abnormal. But I'm not sure if it is going to affect Chinese politics that much. Maybe in a very sort of micro level, if you look at it, it might make China a bit more receptive to it, because it will definitely boost China's international reputation, and it will definitely give China a sort of boost in its dealings with international politics, and also sort of with how it handles its affairs in its neighborhood. I wouldn't say China is opposed or strongly opposed to the LGBTQ plus community as such. It is opposed to any community or any sort of social movement or force that it deems sort of deleterious to its own legitimacy. So I mean, if you look at how China deals with human rights issues in other parts of its territories, and if you look at how it treats LGBTQ plus, it's relatively much more tolerant. It is relatively, and this could also be because it's probably maybe sees the queer community as not very threatening. So they might make they might make significant advancements. I don't want to say they'll never do anything for the community. They might make significant strides. I mean, they had decriminalized homosexuality in 1997, so that's a pretty good starting point if you think about it. I mean, 1997 it's been like a few two almost 2 decades, more than 2 decades for the queer community there. So they definitely see them. They definitely know that there is a huge community and a huge demographic that exists. But as long as the queer community doesn't sort of infringe upon the authority that the party state has, they will keep giving them small concessions here and there. They will be neutral to its sort of proliferation or advancement, as long as it doesn't feel that it's threatening them. So definitely they could have, a great, because advocates, like, activists are advocating for more, reforms. They are advocating for, the recognition of, same sex marriage. That's a very big sort of issue for the queer community in China and in India, of like, uh, recognizing, same sex marriage. And it's definitely something that is on the peripheral of the CPC, but it isn't something that they will prioritize right now. So, like, it's quite a long road. And as long as the queer movement in China can sort of, get incremental wins, they'll take all the wins that they can.
Thank you. We'll have just one last question.
Sure.
So we'll take the first question of Swakshadeep Sarkar. The question is, you talked about new liberalism as a way to promote queer rights. Do you think it might also create inequalities within the queer communities, as we have seen in India and the West as well?
Definitely. Definitely it will. So, like, I would say that, everything has its pros and cons. If you like, it will definitely increase inequality, like you said, but it will also, it will also help bring more visibility vis-a-vis the state. If the state is more interested in sort of, business, like expanding businesses and, making money, then it would be a win for the queer community, or for any community that gets affected by it. But it will definitely, neoliberalism will definitely affect inequality in such a way that, it'll entrench it further. It'll make inequalities much more like polarized, you know and that is going to be true for, like, most societies, for so whatever so that is what I mean by saying that, we'll have to constantly keep learning and unlearning, and constantly keep questioning ourselves. And, like, the queer community has to constantly keep, adapting their strategies, so that, while this is the world that we live in, you'll have to sort of make use of very creative methods to, have your own self interest, like the queer community's interests in the forefront. Yeah.
Thank you so much for answering all of these questions. I think that's it for today. I wish we could take more questions, but we don't have the time for it. We'll now move towards, yeah,
You can, like, just reach out to me if you have any more questions. I'll be happy to answer them. And, yeah.
awesome. We'll share her contact details over emails to all of you. I'd like to invite you, or perhaps anybody else from the ORCA team, to give some final remarks, and then we'll move towards the vote of thanks. I think we do have people from ORCA here. Do they perhaps want to add some points, or
Hi, yes, of
yes?
course. A very, very good evening to everybody. It's so good to see Ahana here after so many days. The speaker series is an excellent initiative by IFPP, and we're very happy we got a chance to collaborate together. I understand that we're running a little ahead of schedule, so I won't take up too much time. But this is a very important topic that I do hope we see Ahana do more research on in the coming days, because there is a dearth of research on this topic. And while she was here at Orca also, this is a very unique ideation she had. And I also understand that a lot of the people in part of this conversation today are students at Ashoka. We do have a very vibrant publication platform wherein we do publish young professionals, younger emerging scholars. In case anybody wants to reach out with topic ideas, they can get in touch with Ahana, who can link them up to us. But thank you very much for including us in this, and congratulations, Ahana, on giving a fantastic speaker session.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Nidhya would perhaps, she's from our founding committee, and she'll now conclude the session with a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Ajitesh. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the organizing team, I would like to extend a vote of thanks. I would like to thank our distinguished speaker, Ms. Ahana Roy, for not only sparing her invaluable time for us to grace this session, but also for enlightening us with her insightful thoughts on this subject. We thank all the members who indulged in asking profound and visionary questions to keep this session running. I would also like to thank Ajitesh Vishwanath for moderating this session. Lastly, I thank the audience for being such patient listeners, and we hope to have all of you on board with us in our future endeavors and sessions. This session would not have been possible without the collaborative efforts of Organization for Research on China and Asia with the Indian Foreign Policy Project. We hope to organize and deliver more such insightful events with them in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much for everybody joining in. We'll see you in the next series. Have a nice day ahead.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Hannah.